Poverty is not just the absence of money, but the absence of opportunity. And the United States is a country where you have both freedom and abundant opportunities. Moving to the United States has given me both. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I came from a close-knit family. I was the third of four children. And the best thing that my parents gave me was the gift of education. Even though I came from a poor family, they gave me education with the instruction that this is the tool that will help me to dig my way out of poverty and ignorance. But what my parents did was that they instilled in us the value of faith, hard work, and not giving up. They made us realize that if you put in the work, you will definitely get the reward. I came without a dime in my pocket. All I had was big dreams, determination to succeed, and the resilience. I got my first job at the age of 14. My job was on a construction site. My duties were to move concrete on a large pan from one end of the construction site to another one. I worked on that day from around 6 in the morning to about 7 at night. At the end of the day, the employer refused to pay me. And the reason was because she did not authorize the foreman to hire me. So I worked from sunup to sundown and didn't get paid. That tore up my spirit. And from that moment on, I decided that I was going to become a lawyer. And I was going to use every ounce of strength within me to fight against injustice, regardless of how powerful the opponent is. I am a man that worked my way up from nothing. I know what it means to feel like you're being unfairly treated, and I'm the person that can stand up to opponents regardless of how big or how powerful they are. Welcome to this episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel the Law Olawale. I have my guest today is a fellow immigrant who's also a leader. She's an attorney. She's also a public office holder. And I am proud to introduce you to Ukeme Jeter. She's also a very wonderful daughter of Nigeria. Welcome, Miss Jeter.
Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to be in the company of a fellow immigrant that shares similar experiences. While we're not a monolithic group by any means, we certainly um, feel at home with each other because there's that understanding that is amongst us.
Thank you. And for those who don't know who Ukeme is, can you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah. So I am an immigrant that immigrated here for college, very much like you, Emmanuel. I was raised one of seven children in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, which is the southeastern part of Nigeria. Um, in Nigeria, we're relatively middle class, but that means nothing when you come to the United States. Uh, my parents chose America for my education because I was a female and they didn't want after an education to just end up in the kitchen, right? Um, they wanted me to have fair opportunities to use my brain. And so, America being so far ahead with equity in gender, I ended up here for college and became an engineer and kind of very much like you worked myself up. Pivoted my career after about 7 years as an engineer and felt that I could have better impact as a lawyer. And I had more interest in the legal end of things. And so now I practice intellectual property law. So I like to say I'm still the geeky engineer I was when I came to the United States, just on the legal end of things, just thinking about innovation and how we protect innovation and how we use innovation for the betterment of everyone, right? Sometimes innovation can feel very monopolistic. There's a monopoly on what you invent, but done right, it is access to good for everyone. And then the last hat that I wear is as an elected official, which is a relatively new hat. I've been serving now for about a year and a half, and first person of color to be elected to my great city, the city of Upper Arlington.
Thank you. And what was it like growing up in Nigeria and going to school there?
Yeah. You know, I have very fond memories. We're a close knit family, large family. My mom is one of 20. Her My grandfather was a chief, had two wives, and so that resulted in a lot of kids. So on my mom's side of the family, and I got to see firsthand how women were not given the opportunities for education. My mom um, has the equivalent of an eighth grade education here in America, and she decided, I mean, part of marrying my dad was also just to advance her education. My dad's experience is very different. My dad was educated, very, very well educated, actually. My dad came here to the United States for college, and then returned to Nigeria. So, yeah, so he was an international student here. Uh, so growing up, I grew up where my parents always validated and said, what a man can do, a woman can do. I grew up with four other sisters. We were five girls, two boys, and so it was very important. My parents, for us as females growing up in Nigeria in an environment that sometimes made you feel less than because of your gender, to have parents that gave us the opportunity to explore. And when I gravitated towards math and math and science, my dad's a biochemist, so I feel like it was inevitable. We have the periodic table as art in our house. Uh, they weren't shy about that. They made sure that I was able to pursue that dream of being an engineer without any barriers. I remember sometimes there'll be aunts, they'll be like, "You an engineer? No, like, why don't you go be a nurse?" Right? There were even gender roles in terms of what kind of career you could pursue, and so I was fortunate to grow up with parents that gave me exposure and opportunities to see that I could be, and there were no limits on my dreams just because of my gender.
There are no limits on your dream just because of your gender. That is very progressive. And
Yeah,
then you moved to the United States to pursue that education. What
yeah.
was that transition like for you? And how old were you at that time?
Yeah, wow. It was wild. I have come to learn it's called culture shock. So a unique part of my experience growing up, like I said, my dad's a biochemist. He worked in oil and gas for Shell Oil, so he was had a great career. So we had the opportunity when he was an expat, and so we were an expat in Muscat, Oman, in the Middle East. And so I had an experience living overseas. But that was a very different experience because you're living overseas with your parents. And so you have the comfort and the shelter of your parents. And we're also in expat communities. So almost everyone around me were from a different country. It was like the United Nations, right? Everyone had a different coming to story. And so it was this very dynamic environment. And I think when I came to the United States, having had that experience, I somehow thought to myself it would be a similar experience. So the shock was those expectations were not the same, right? I went to college, University of Maine, and not only is it super cold, um, I for the first time realized my minorityness, right? I grew up in Nigeria and black 365 days a year, and everyone around me is too. Even when I was an expat, right? Everyone's international, everyone's from a very different place. And so I had never had the opportunity to really be a minority. Um, and so I'm in Maine. Not only that, I'm also an engineer, and I went to an all girls boarding school. So I was around a lot of smart females, right? And I come into my engineering class, I am one of three females. So it's this double whammy in addition to being an international student. It took a lot of persistence and determination to remember why I had taken the journey. I was the first one in my family to come to the United States. I've since had four other sisters, three other sisters join. But so also being the first in my family to do that, to feel like I was charting the way in case my other siblings wanted the experience. A lot felt like it was riding on me to figure out the experience, but it was quite a culture shock. And I
Yes.
quickly surrounded myself with people that helped me navigate those experiences.
Yes. It's always that shock for the first person that decided to be the trailblazer. With my experience, coming to the U.S., as I put it in my book,
Yeah.
that was the first time I realized that I was black.
Yes.
Because in most of your existence in Nigeria, no one described you as being black. It's just a reality of existence until you come to the United States and realize that racial hierarchy, and
Yeah.
that was quite a culture shock. And but then you've got to adjust. How was that racial identity?
Yeah.
So, how did that play in your own transition?
Yeah. What see, so what happened and what played in my transition was how much I did not know about the Black American experience. Um, in Trinidad, again, I'm from the southeastern part of Nigeria, so close to the Cameroon waters and the part of Nigeria that slaves actually left, right? So
Oh,
Calabar, yes. So Calabar, there were actually slaves that left those shores. So I had the knowledge that this happened, right? And my mom, having grown up there, recalls from her experience and her hearing from my granddad, that people had been sold, right? Um, it felt like very much like an economic transaction. And knowing also from the part of Nigeria that I was, there were people that served as house helps, right? That's something that happens in Nigeria, and most of the house helps are from my part of the country, right? So when you when you hear that ikaite or the stereotype in Nigeria of the kind of people that serve as aides in the home and stuff like that, that also came from my village. So I didn't fully grasp the enslavement part of it, right? Because in Nigeria, the people that serve as house helps, they're not enslaved, right? It's a job, right? And so when I came and was starting to hear more stories, the mentality that comes with being not having freedom was something I don't think I fully understood. And so I had to lean on the African American friends that I made to understand it, right? To understand what it really means to be free and what that journey caused in terms of what I call this long haul mental toll, right? To be limited again in your dreams based on your gender, to not based on your race, to not um, have the opportunities to an education or to go to the classroom, right? Um, it's a long term effect, right? And the difference was when I came to America, like when you see me, I'm black, so you just assume that I understand the Black American experience, but it's something I had to learn when I was here.
That is the re-education of the African immigrant that comes to well, I wouldn't say every new immigrant, only the black immigrant that chose to learn it. Because oftentimes people misunderstand the experience of someone like me and someone like you and someone who was born, raised, and bred black in the United States. And when you decided to go to law school,
Mm,
what inspired that, especially after you've been working as an engineer for almost a decade?
yeah, great question. I think the short answer is when I started working as an engineer, I realized that I liked studying it. I liked the classroom theoretical aspects of engineering and not necessarily um, the work part of it. But hindsight is always 2020, because I think what I experienced was more so the gender lack in STEM influences the experience. So I feel like if I had had a better experience as a female in engineering, I likely would have stayed. There were no, I didn't have any female mentors. I didn't completely understand how to navigate the environment. It was tough for me to see what my future as an engineer would be. It was hard for me to imagine 25 more years of this, right? Um, and so as I looked around and started taking stock on what do I want to do long term, I saw more females as lawyers in America. Um, I saw the impact that legal had on decision making in companies, in um, the way people live their lives. And for me, work has always been more than just a paycheck. The paycheck is nice, don't get me wrong, but also the impact that I'm going to be able to have. I was a wastewater treatment engineer, and that really meant I was trying to think about how we use water differently in processes and save water. Looking back at it, it was a very noble thing to do if I had the right mentors that tied purpose to the work for me. And that I just didn't have that, didn't see that. And so I saw law as a pivot to get that fulfillment that I needed for work, and it has paid off. But when I look back, I think that's really why I left. I wasn't able to find fulfillment long term in engineering, despite how good I did in my engineering classes.
Hmm. I love the fact that you mentioned the word mentor and not having that mentor. That's also, since we're talking about the importance of immigrant leadership,
Mm.
mentorship is what I found personally lacking, especially in most first generation immigrants, because I experienced the same thing. It just so happened that I was able to go to law school just out of a chance experience to talk to one person on one fortunate night. I had that ambition, but I had no mentor. In fact, I didn't even know any black attorney, any immigrant attorney. And that lack of mentorship kind of affect your growth. Even though you might be where you are right now, I might be where I am right now. I believe if there have been mentors to tell you where to go, what to do, and things like that, the road will have been easier. But for a trailblazer, it takes you to use that gut feeling, figure it out yourself, and hopefully you'll be lucky.
Oh yeah, I mean, I say it now all the time. I can't overemphasize the importance of of a mentor, and one that is well done, right? Because sometimes there are these programs out there, but there's got to be a connection for it to really work.
Yes, that's what I tell people. I'm like, okay, I don't know how much else to tell you.
Right?
You won't even know that those things exist.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you might be sharing space with people, but you're really not having the same experience.
Yeah, yeah, and it's
Just
funny you say
sharing
that because
space.
I talk about that. I talk about that in my book about the critical role that mentorship plays, especially for immigrant leadership. Um, it is, we tell immigrants all the time, and immigrants have their own fair share of determination and persistence, and they can literally make anything work, right? Which is the indomitable spirit of immigrants, which I call immigrant, right? Um, but for them to advance to leadership, because we see immigrants do a lot of functional things well. They're engineers, they're lawyers, they're scientists, those kind of things. But how many immigrant CEOs do you see, despite the fact that almost 50% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants? So they're entrepreneurial, they're inventors, they create things, but we don't advance them to executive leadership. And from the ones that I've talked to, the ones I've interviewed, the ones I've read their stories, mentorship is the reason they're not there.
mentorship. You can overemphasize that.
Mhm.
Can you share your own personal journey as an immigrant in the
Yeah.
corporate world?
Yeah, yeah, and I've been in different types of settings. I've done um, the UN. I've done Fortune 500 companies. I've done private practice. So I've had a fair share of experiences across the board. Um, and talent gets you in the door, right? And so that has always been my experience, right? I have gotten into all these doors based on what's on my resume, right? Um, I have advanced in my roles, less about talent, more about who speaks up for what you do. So the systems need to recognize more than your talent. Again, we tell immigrants all the time, do this, do that, you do this, you do this, you get advanced. But that's not really how it works. The advancement to leadership is on the systems to see certain things as leaders. I always like to ask this question, and I get a blank stare. I say, when was the last time you had a senior leader with an accent? Right? These kind of things, accent biases, language barriers, what we think or feel a leader should be, are a group think kind of made up box on this is what a leader should look like. And absent of the British immigrant that speaks the Queen's English, no other immigrant makes that box as to what is traditionally thought about as leadership. So it's been my experience that the systems, the DE&I efforts, and we've seen a lot of that in the last 2-3 years post George Floyd, right? The increased significance of DEI, even it's always been there. DEI still misses that bucket. It still misses the fact that um, we look for certain things in leaders, which immigrants already have, but we don't hear it how we want to hear it. Maybe the accent, maybe how they conduct themselves, right? Maybe like what we think a leader should look like.
Thank you. There's that you mentioned that bias as to what leadership looks like, who fits into that box. That's coming from the dominant culture. There's also the flip side of the educated immigrant who was like a natural leader in their, let me say, comfort zone.
Yeah,
But then when it comes to the dominant culture, they have this, I don't want to call it an inferiority complex, but um, maybe more as if they don't belong.
yeah,
And because of that as well, they don't aspire to position of leadership.
yeah,
What's your prescription to combating that in your upcoming book?
yeah. So aspiration is absolutely critical, right? I as part of the book, I interviewed some senior leaders, and they don't know that immigrants want to lead, right? There's no aspiration. The very fundamental is aspiration. Um, and so I say ask to lead, right? Half the problem is not asking and not aspiring, right? That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is when the ask is made, when the aspiration is there, it's now on the system, so on the corporations, on the dominant culture to say, okay, this is not what our leader profile is. Most companies have like leadership competencies or what the leadership profile is. Immigrants naturally have all of those. Their natural advantages are, grit, persistence, determination, resourcefulness. The experience, the immigrant experience already utilizes these skills repeatedly. So they have them. They're all soft skills that we want in leaders. But what switches that, or what now makes that being seen as leadership competencies within corporations, is the ask, right? And the advancement, the opportunities for them to do it their way. Because what then happens with the dominant culture is we say you've got to assimilate to a particular type or style of leadership. And so assimilation becomes the peril, right? Assimilation, forcing an immigrant to assimilate to a certain way, you lose their brilliance. You lose what makes immigrant leadership so special.
Exactly. Because immigrant leadership is very special because you bring to that table diverse experience. And
Hmm.
most oftentimes, every perfection is an illusion. You can always amend it. Excellence is much better. And
Yeah.
immigrants actually bring that perspective.
Yes.
And now you just talked about how an immigrant can deal with that imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
And then when an immigrant gets to a position of leadership, what's your prescription for instilling that style of leadership
Yeah.
on the culture of that corporate setting or city or government or just the dominant culture by itself?
Yeah. Um, well, this is where the environment matters, right? So the where a plant thrives, where there's sun, water, all the right ingredients for them to do so. Immigrants are the same way in the sense that the environment has to allow them to lead authentically. And they do so by communicating how they communicate, right? They may not have the idioms. So in America, we use a lot of sports references, football references, basketball references. We use a lot of TV shows to emphasize our points, right? And I distinctly remember in college when I came and everyone talked about Seinfeld. Like everything was an episode of Seinfeld. Like they would reference something, right? And I felt this innate need to watch every single episode of Seinfeld so that I could belong, so I could fit. Now, those are unintentional ways in which the environment um, forces people to be a certain way. And so, for immigrants to truly lead in their brilliance, we've got to allow them to do it their way. They don't have to use the idioms, right? The saying, when in Rome, act like the Romans, is actually hinders them from being. So if they spend their energy trying to communicate the way you believe that leaders should communicate, use the idioms that you would use, then you don't allow them tell their stories, right? I come from a culture in Nigeria which has a lot of parables and proverbs, and my mom, in teaching us lessons, right, will use an ancient folk tale. I ought to be able to do the same thing in my leadership at work versus using a Seinfeld episode. So that those are the things where the environment has to allow them to thrive in their own way without assimilating.
Hmm. Yeah,
Because
that's
here's the thing, Emmanuel, assimilation is inevitable, right? After you've been in an environment long enough, you bring what you have with you and add to it. The downfall is when it's a forced assimilation, right? We take them through leadership development classes and we say it has to be this way. We don't take them through leadership development classes and say, hey, what is it that you bring to the table? Okay, how do we enhance that? How do we lean into what your brilliance is and make that shine, right? That's how leadership development should work, for all people, really, but most especially for immigrants.
so. What I'm hearing you say is that the immigrant experience, the immigrant can enhance existing leadership by bringing their own cultural metaphors and idioms and systems into that existing system to make it
Absolutely.
better.
Absolutely. And
And
the
the
people they
dominant,
lead benefit from it too. The people they lead have an expanded perspective. My parents always used to emphasize exposure in everything, right? And so we traveled a lot. And the reason for that is my parents would say, you will learn more from being exposed to something than having to, learn it from someone or feel like, you have to be in it. You have to, that is your most authentic self when you have that exposure. And so not only does the leader get to lead within their brilliance, but the team that they lead gets to see more of the world through them.
Exactly. That's what I also tell my kids as we expose them to all these experiences, because the reality of life is that you can only aspire based on the level of your exposure. And the same comes with understanding. The more you're exposed to new experiences, the more you widen your spectrum of experience.
Yeah.
And now, when you decided to become an attorney,
Mm-hmm.
you had the law school experience, you graduated, and you became an attorney. How did you decide what kind of law you wanted to practice?
Yeah. Great question. Well, I went to law school during the economic downturn, and so opportunities were pretty limited at that time. When I went in, because I had been a wastewater treatment engineer, um, I was very attuned to environmental issues and environmental ills, and I loved the idea of doing some kind of compliance, regulatory, environmental type of law. That was my mindset going into law school, and kind of seeking. That was the Al Gore era, um, trying to seek opportunities that way. Well, when you get to law school can be very litigation heavy, very litigation focused. I was never one of those that came in thinking I wanted to be in the courtroom. And so while I took those classes, and I think while most of the first year or two of law school is very heavy on reading briefs and um, opinions and those kind of things, I quickly talk about mentors. Got to connected with a professor that was an intellectual property law professor. He had an opportunity, or told me about an opportunity at the UN, with an organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the IP arm of the UN. Just very much like you have World Health, all those kind of things. This was the IPN. And that organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, thinks about IP globally, and thinks about how, say, maybe America develops this drug, but someone in a third world country needs it. How do we broker those learnings so people have the innovation they need despite them not developing? And I found this idea very fascinating, and found the idea of IP and the good that IP can do globally. And we've got to see it now with the pandemic really play out, right? And who had vaccines, who developed them, who owns IP for vaccines, but how everybody in the world needs them, right? And so he's telling about this opportunity, and it sounds fascinating. And and he's like, your engineering end of this works very well together. Funny enough, I'd never been told about intellectual property, even having been an engineer. Most IP attorneys, at least the patent end of IP attorneys, have an engineering background. But so this is the importance of like knowing things, like people that that's like it had never occurred to me till my first year of law school. And so I ended up taking that opportunity for a summer at WIPO in Geneva, Switzerland. Best time of my life, best experience of my life. And that's kind of how IP came about. My boss at the time, who is still a dear friend and mentor to me, kind of told me the different career paths. And what is powerful about a good mentor is that the good mentor looks at your career 360. So not only your career, but how that impacts what aspirations you have for a family life, right? Um, where you want to live. Like, it's the whole thing. And so this mentor at WIPO kind of painted for me, well, if you want to be a mom someday, here are the realities of the jobs that you can do, right? And all these things were great advice. We try to tell ourselves we can do it all. And yes, we can do it all. We can't do it all at the same time if we're going to be realistic. And a good mentor will help you map out what that looks like. And so that's how I ended up in IP. That's how I ended up doing intellectual property law.
You can't overstress the importance of a good mentor,
Yeah.
especially for anyone,
Yeah.
but especially for an immigrant who aspire to lead. And talking about aspiration to lead, it's just to you, it's not just an aspiration. You decided to actually seek public office, which was
Yeah.
historical, because in Upper Arlington, in where you live, there hasn't been any person of color nominated by any major party or actually seek election and got elected.
Yeah.
So the question is, what inspired you
Yeah.
to go on that path?
Yeah. Something that, again, and never on my purview, right? You'd never have told me, goodness, you'll be an elected official. My daughter was the reason that I aspired to public office. And I moved to Central Ohio. This August will be 5 years. My daughter was just about to start kindergarten. And we chose a community for the things that I think most people choose a community for, right? We wanted good schools. Proximity was important to me, right? I needed to be close to downtown. Wanted good parks and rec, the feeling of safety, all these things. And Upper Arlington checked the boxes in more ways than one for all these things that we were looking for. So we picked our home in a very traditional style, how people will pick a home based on what they think for the environment. What I did not know was how my daughter would feel in a community that was predominantly white. Remember, I grew up Black. And I love what you said that you never realized you were Black till you came to the United States. Same, right? I'd never had the word Black used with me till I was 18 years old. And so that was not my lived experience. So here my daughter was having a lived experience that was dramatically different than the lived experience I had had. And so her lived experiences were her really feeling Black at 5 years old. And I'll tell you at 5 years old, how that plays out is that she wants her hair to look different, right? Mom, can you straighten my hair for school tomorrow? The dolls that she's playing with, right? Even if she absolutely loves her Black dolls, she's not leaving the home with her Black dolls. She's leaving the home with her white dolls. So again, she's finding ways that she can be different for the dominant culture, for the dominant people. And that broke my heart because I had chosen this community for our family, and she was having an experience that wasn't going to bode well in the long term, right? I always want her to have a good sense of herself, a good sense of being enough and okay despite the environment. And so that experience is really what made me start doing work kind of like on the ground, boots to ground level. So going into her classroom, figuring out what was causing those kind of experience. The library, like all these different places that she lived and she played, I wanted to make sure looked or at least she felt enough in those spaces. And funny enough, I'd never in my mind thought that the governing body that impacts all these different spaces is city council. Because again, not being exposed to it, no one in my family is an elected official. I'm an immigrant. Politics, worked very different in Nigeria. It was a military rule till it wasn't, right? So democracy is something that's still very, very new in Nigeria. So I didn't completely understand the impact that had till someone told me as I was doing the boots on the ground work. You're doing all this work. I put on the city's first Black History Month, all these things, and someone says, Ukeme, you're doing all this work. You should run for office. So it took that light bulb going off by someone saying it for me to understand that my daughter needed to see that representation, because she wasn't going to see her first Black teacher till she's in the 8th grade, right? The Black people that she saw were cleaning her classrooms, and she needed to see, very much like I saw when I was growing up. I saw Black doctors, I saw Black nurses, I saw Black police officers, I saw a Black president. I needed her to see similar things. And so I ran for office.
you can only aspire according to the level of your exposure.
Yes, sir.
So you decide to be that exposure for your daughter and
Absolutely.
also for a lot of other black kids, even adults that are out there that may not even have that aspiration for leadership.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you say that because I did it for my daughter, but as I was campaigning and hearing the stories and hearing people say, wow, this is important for my daughter. This is important for me, right? Like that was just additional motivation and a full understanding of like the impact that would have on so many people. So we like to throw percentages out, right? Upper Arlington is 2% black, okay, but that's 660 people with 33,000. So it's not it's a tiny number when you think about it as a percentage, but when you take that percentage out and give it a number, 660 people, it matters. It
It
matters.
does it does matter. It does matter. Even 2% salt in water can make a whole lot of difference.
Yes, I love that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. And thank you for doing that. And what was that like for you on the night of the election when you discovered that? Because it was actually a tight race, because I was following.
Yes.
What
Yes.
was that moment for you when you realized I did it?
Yeah. Well, the beautiful thing is my mom was at the watch party, my sister, my kids, I had a few friends. So you psych yourself up because you don't with elections you don't really know how it's going to go till it goes, right? So if anything, I wanted to be surrounded with the people that I loved. So there was that. But as the results started to come in, and it was like, oh my goodness, this could happen. It was when it was called, uh, and I was elected. It was surreal. It felt unbelievable. Listen, the odds were crazy. I'd only lived in the community 2.5 years at that point. Um, Not that other black people didn't live or were not qualified to run or any of that kind of stuff, but to be the first at something, um, there's no blueprint for it. It's it's very monumental. It is. I was in awe, but it also, for me, because when you think about it, again, only 2% of black. So the majority of people that voted were people that did not look like me, that wanted this change for the community. And so at the depths of my heart was also just this insane gratitude because the message that had been spoken through the campaign resonated. And that people's votes is basically validating and saying, we believe you can do this, and go do it for us. Um, and so it also came with an insane amount of responsibility.
Validation and responsibility. And now you're working on a book that talks about immigrant leadership.
Yeah.
What inspired you to want to to write the book?
Yeah. Um, I love that my life is so off script. Nothing, like everything comes as it comes, right? So when I got elected, my alma mater called me up and asked me to give the commencement speech to the 2020 and 2021 class. Um, and I was the distinguished alumni. Obviously, I got the honor because I had been elected for office. And so last year, I went to my alma mater and I gave the commencement speech. And the class I was giving the commencement speech to was the pandemic class, right? Um, and so I fashioned my speech to help them understand not what they had lost, but what they had gained, and gained from the fact that they went through the pandemic, right? So they had to pivot quickly. It took a lot of determination to do online classes, right? To miss out on the social element that you come to college for, all these things. And I did that juxtaposed against my experience as an immigrant, right? Where I was telling the same thing, being an immigrant here, you pivot quickly. You have to be resourceful. I mean, I I knew of computers when I came here, but I'd never like written an entire assignment on a computer before. I had to learn that, right? You got to learn quickly. You got to be super resourceful. All these things. So I'm telling the story as part of my commencement speech, my immigrant story, and highlighting for them how what they had learned from the pandemic was also similar competencies And then those competencies were leadership competencies, and they should go out into the world and live out their dreams. I get off that commencement stage, and international student after international student comes up to me, and they say, "Wow, I've never really thought about my immigrant experience as giving me leadership competencies, as arming me with leadership competencies." Right? The immigrant story is, when told, when achievement is told of the immigrant story is told, you've achieved the American dream, right? And it's this, we have this fascination with survival and thriving and getting to somewhere, right? And we don't think about how it refines us, how it gives us leadership competencies. And so these international students are telling me this, and the light bulb goes off for me, because I too, right, didn't realize that those experiences are what make me the leader I am today, right? They're what impact my leadership style. They're what impact how I lead. And as I thought about the literature that was out there, there's a lot of literature that tells minorities, immigrants, do this, be this way, do that, and you'll get this, right? We don't talk to the systems about the system saying, recognize this too, right? There's not that literature that says to our leaders, that says to our talent development professionals, that says to people that are designing leadership development programs, understand this, particularly as it comes to immigrants, because the DE&I conversation helps you understand gender and race. But within that, they miss the intersectionality, that the accents create an additional bias, right? That the lack of understanding of a football play hinders you from leadership, you know? So it became this rousing thing that I felt like I needed to do to add to that literature to make sure that we understood how to develop immigrant leaders, because we were missing that in the conversation.
So the lack of conversation about how the dominant culture can accept the immigrant is what inspired you, because you
Yeah,
have literatures out there that tells the immigrant what to
yeah,
do, how to assimilate, how to naturalize, but nothing that teaches the dominant culture and how to also be accepting of the gift the immigrant brings to the table.
absolutely.
And how does immigrant, you call it immigrant?
Yes, immigrants.
Immigrants is a very loaded word, and I
Yes.
don't want to be the one to break it down because I know the semiotics of it. But I would like you to tell the people listening to this, how did you coin that term, and what does
Term. Well, I'm an intellectual property attorney, so obviously I play with brands and words all day long. But for me, I coined the term immigrant because as I talked to immigrant after immigrant after immigrant, there were repeated skills that came up, right? Resilience, adaptability, resourcefulness, right? These things make up the immigrant. And it doesn't matter, again, we're not a monolithic group. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic status you come from. It doesn't matter what country you come from. It doesn't matter what your gender is. The very experience of leaving your home country, coming here, even with whether you have a penny in your pocket or a million in your pocket, right? The ease in how these things happen will be different, but you have to go through that experience. You have to go through adapting. You have to go through resilience. You have to go through resourcefulness, right? You don't have an inbuilt network here. Even if you have like two family friends and like a whole village somewhere in America, you still have to build your networks here, right? And now, of course, and I immigrated here in 1999. It was quite an expensive endeavor to call, to make a phone call. Now we have WhatsApp and all these kind of things. So there is a little bit more interconnectedness in today's world with Zoom and all of that, but you still have to build that groundwork here, and those skills are just innate in the immigrant experience. And so that's why I called it immigrant. It's a artful term to summarize all those skills that immigrants have.
Mm, yeah, because you have to build that new network.
Yeah.
The way I put it, I see the USA as an acronym for you start all over. As an immigrant, you have to
I
respect
love
yourself.
that.
Yes,
I love that.
so you have to, and that's one of the things that new immigrants have to, that's what you have to do. You have to rebuild your network. You have to, even if you come for school, you still have to start all over because most things do not translate.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
talking about starting all over for the immigrants, how can a company or an organization recognize that immigrant experience and interwove that into their leadership structure?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Um, and I talk about that in the book. First of all, you got to reward cognitive diversity, and what I mean by that is you've got to reward um, differences, right? An accent is an additional benefit, right? Growing up in a different country is an additional benefit, right? We have a preset of diversity that we think about: the racial, the gender, the sexual orientation, right? And we've got to broaden that out to get more immigrants into the fold. The second thing is we've got to interrupt our biases. Okay. Um, and accents and where someone goes to school are some of the biggest things with interrupting your biases. So I think about while I came here for undergrad and I have an undergrad degree, a lot of the skilled immigrants actually come for graduate school. So they have an undergraduate degree that's in their country. Um, and it's tongue in cheek, but it's true. The law of gravity, whether you learn the law of gravity in, you know, Polish, or you learn it in Arabic, or you learn it in German, the law of gravity is the law of gravity, right? So the law of gravity taught to an engineer in Saudi Arabia is the same as taught to an engineer here in America. So when we look at education, right? We've got to interrupt the bias of saying, oh, well, and our, because our certification programs don't help, right? Our certification programs say you have to have a US accredited school or whatever to become a professional engineer. Our doctors have the same experience. The heart is the same regardless of where the human being is. So a doctor that learns the heart in Nigeria very likely knows the heart in the United States, right? Or knows how the lung functions. So we've got to start appreciating, right, that education, especially with standard concepts, are the same, regardless of where they are. And we start doing that. We start we break down accents and think about, as long as we're communicating, it doesn't matter how it sounds. It doesn't matter what I say, water. Like, did you hear? Did you understand that it meant water? Then communication happened, right? So these two things, cognitive diversity and interrupting biases, is kind of where a company starts with accepting the whole of the immigrant.
Thank you. From my experience, what I've realized is that my personal diversity of experience is also what makes me unique and to assimilate into immigrant leadership in the United States. And for you, having lived in 8 cities, 3 different countries, and 3 different continents, how does that shape your view
Yeah.
as a leader? And what advice will you have for people who have such life experiences?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything, right? You don't come in a new place leaving all of that, right? It helps with my relatability. Chances are, having lived in so many vast places, I've been exposed to so many different types of people, so many different styles. You know, I can live with the light, or if you're like in Nigeria, there's no light. Like when there's power outages, I'm not phased, right? So there's like certain, there's just an array of things that we kind of underappreciate, but because we've been exposed to it, we know how to do it, right? You know how to start a fire, whether you're starting it with gas or kerosene, or whether you're doing it with charcoal. right? All these things are lived experiences. And I may not be a camper, right? I may not want to sleep in a cabin out in the woods, but please believe I know how to start a fire, right? Just because I haven't camped before, right? So you start to make these connections with your different experiences when you've had that, and it helps with relating to your team, um, and relating with a varied set of people. And empathy is also the other big part.
Empathy. Tell us more about empathy.
So empathy, people always feel like it's that you have to have that lived experience. No, empathy is being able to pull from something that you've experienced to understand what the other person is feeling. It doesn't have to be the exact thing. So really getting in there with them. And when you've had a vast that diversity experience that you talk about, it opens up your world to be able to find something to relate to them and truly relate, right? It's not saying I've been there, it's saying I understand that. I can understand that. I can understand that feeling.
So it's not just intellectual empathy, it
Yeah,
is cultural empathy,
absolutely.
which goes a long way.
Absolutely.
So, how can companies pivot their culture to accepting the immigrant experience? Because culture is very hard to shift, especially sometimes it takes many generations
Yeah.
to move the needle when it comes to culture. So, what's your prescription for companies willing to assimilate, accept that immigrant leadership?
Yeah, culture is such a big part. And so culture you get by the people around the difference, respecting and appreciating the difference. You also celebrate the difference regardless of how small. We I'll go back to that 2% black, right? People say, well, why have a whole Black History Month in the city for just 2% black people? No, no, no. It exposes other people to that culture. They may not have another chance in their life to eat that food, right? But you celebrate, Asian American History Month. You celebrate all these different things because you have that culture within your company. And now all of a sudden you're exposing the other employees to them, and then the organic conversations happen. What is this? When do you use it? How do you use it? All of a sudden, that inbuilt culture around them. So that person is no longer a unicorn, but kind of like part of us because we have seen some parts of how they live. It is also incumbent on the immigrant themselves sometimes to bring the different person along with them, right? So I will take a colleague to a Nigerian restaurant and for lunch. Oh, you want to have lunch? Let's have lunch. We're going to this Nigerian restaurant to have lunch. It gives them an exposure to me because 9 out of 10 times I'm going to go to an American restaurant with you for lunch. But 1 out of those 10 times, try this different thing. So it's a push and pull in the sense where the immigrant themselves helps to advance that culture by really being very prescriptive about it. And then on the other hand, the company themselves does the celebrating and the marking and the understanding of the events for them.
Thank you. The immigrant has to be intentional in educating the people they're exposed to. And
Yes,
the company also have to be open to receive the cultural education.
absolutely. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Do you have like a date, a proposed date that the book is going to be released?
So, well, the manuscript is actually 90% done, almost done. It will be done here in like 2 weeks. And then my
Congratulations.
editor, I know I'm so excited. Thank you so much. Our plan is to have this by early 2024. We'll get into the deep editing, the pre-sale campaign, all those kind of things, and that's going to take about 6 months. So early 2024. This book will be out, and I cannot wait. It has been a true labor of passion and love because what I did not have was time in the gamut of everything that I have going on. But it's been a true labor of love to produce this book.
Well, you're an immigrant with the grit, and I'm sure
Oh,
you found the time.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been about an hour. So we're going to ask you, what is it like for you? What does it mean for you to come on this show to talk about your book? What does it mean for you to come on Legal Angle?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for creating this space. And it's like just been an absolute pleasure to talk with someone that has shared experiences, right? So this felt like a conversation with a brother and a friend, and so thanks for creating that space to share a very different story, right? Another thing with just the immigrant experience is there's not enough immigrant stories out there. We're too quick to assimilate and make everything an American story, and sometimes we need to hold space for different stories. So thanks for holding space for that.
Thank you. And thanks also for sharing your story, educating us about immigrant leadership. And I'm looking forward to reading the book and also to bringing you back on the show to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you watching and listening to this, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. And don't forget to subscribe to our channels on YouTube, our Facebook page, and to subscribe to the podcast. Until next time, take care. Bye for now.